Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy podcast. I'm your host, Steve. If you like listening to this podcast, you can now watch it on YouTube. Go over to YouTube and search for the History of the Papacy podcast. And while you're there and enjoying those great videos, make sure you like the video, hit the subscribe button, and then ring the bell to get more videos just like this. I think you'll really enjoy them. We also have exclusive content on the History of the Papacy YouTube channel and the video channels that includes the History of the Papacy in 10 minutes, which is basically a sidetrack episode, but in a documentary format. So a short little chunk of papal history in 10 minutes, and I think you'll definitely enjoy those. If you're interested in further supporting the show and actually becoming a member of the show, you should definitely head over to patreon.com/history of the papacy to learn more about joining at all of the various different levels of support. The biggest thing for you is that you get to be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. Now, in traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the list of bishops who are commemorated. The first to be commemorated are the first in, and so you want to get on these lists early. There's many other benefits for joining, and so if you go over to the Patreon page, you'll definitely be able to learn more about that. I want to thank two people who've just joined onto the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have John at the Alexandria level, and we have Eduardo at the Antioch level. Thank you very much for joining on the History of the Papacy on Patreon. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, and John at the Alexandria level. Dapo, Paul, and Justin, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level. And then reaching that ultimate power and prestige, we have Peter the Great. Now, if you listen to our episode on the paradigm shift and thinking on the history of the liturgy, you'll be familiar with Professor Andrew Mesmer. Well, Professor Mesmer has joined us again to talk about a really important topic in Christian history called justification. Now, Professor Mesmer was on part 1 last time where he's kind of set the stage for justification, and this is part 2 of that conversation. I would kind of suggest you go back and listen to part 1, but if that's not your thing, go ahead and listen to part 2, then listen to part 1, or listen to part 1, part 2, and then listen to them again. You got a lot of choices on the History of the Papacy. But, the point of these episodes on theology is to really delve into what people think, because that is the driver of history. And I think we really get into that in these episodes. So if you like this kind of episode, definitely leave a video comment or email me, leave an iTunes review. That's always appreciated. And really just keep in mind that this idea of justification is a thread that winds its way through virtually the entire history of Western Christianity. So I hope you enjoy, and I'll talk to you soon. Maybe we'll come back to that. I have to think a little bit about that one. Let's go to that. It really plays into the practical and the practical melding in with and completely enmeshing itself with the higher issue, because then if you're saying that certain people, they have to keep these certain laws and certain conditions, but other people don't, and you're going to where it's the same point, you're both going towards that same goal, then what's the point of doing nothing of the law, or doing some of it, or doing all of it?
Well, you can even see that very issue being wrestled through in the New Testament. So it's interesting if your readers grab a New Testament that has the words of Jesus in red, and they go to like Mark's, I'm pretty sure it's Mark 7, He has this debate with the Pharisees and about washing hands with eating with washed hands or unwashed hands and what all that means. And then he gets to a point where he says, it's not what goes in to the stomach that defiles you, it's what comes out. And then the red words stop in most translations. And then there's this black phrase in parentheses, at least in some translations, and it says, thereby making all foods clean. And so, and then you can go to Paul, and Paul in Romans chapter 14, in 1 Corinthians 8, 9, 10, I think it's chapter 10. He is wrestling through this issue of Jews are accustomed to keep certain laws. Do they have to? And even if they don't have to, what if they prefer doing it? What if it's so ingrained in them that if they stop doing it, it would really cause, a crisis of faith or a real, they just feel very uncomfortable with it. They can't quite get over the hump, to say it like that, of that black phrase expression, thereby making all foods clean. They just can't quite get there. And Paul is wrestling with that very issue there. I mean, his ultimate goal is, look, if you want to keep the law, then do it to God's glory. And if you don't want to keep the law, then don't keep it to God's glory. But each one do it to God's glory. That was kind of his bottom line answer.
Let's move on. Was justification, or at least salvation by grace through faith, ever discussed in the early church? And if so, what did they say about it?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, because what we find when we try to find debates on justification, like the word, just a lexical study looking for the word dikeo, dikeosini, any of the Deke word groups, we find very little discussion about it. We really don't find it developed until around the 4th century, and it picks up big time with Augustine. So before Augustine, we do have some discussion of it. So I just read you a couple of quotes here. This is from First Clement. First Clement was he was the bishop in Rome. Well, history of the papacy, I don't need to say. Bishop in Rome, 1st century. He's writing right at the end of the 1st century, and in his letter, he says he's talking about Jacob, and he's talking about how they have received these wonderful blessings, and then he says all of these people, they were glorified and magnified not through themselves or through their own works or the righteous actions that they did, but through God's will. And so we, having been called through his will in Jesus Christ, we are not justified through ourselves or through our own wisdom or understanding or piety or works that we have done, but through faith, by which the Almighty God has justified all who have existed from the beginning. Or you can go to like the Odes of Solomon, which is probably a late first century work. Ode 29, it just says, it has the line of the person being baptized. He's talking about the Messiah, and the person being baptized says, he has justified me by his grace. There it's Syriac, which is basically Aramaic, but it's the same concept of being justified by grace. So we don't find a lot of discussion about it. Like, we do find a lot of discussion about other things. We do find discussion about the unity of the church. We do find discussion about the correct day to celebrate Easter. We find discussion about, and these were big things about the person of Christ, about his incarnation and about his deity. But this is one of those issues where in the early church, we just don't find a lot on it. Now, that's not too surprising, because we also don't find reflection, at least deep reflection, on other things like the atonement, or even the sacraments, predestination, eschatology, some of these other things that we think, wow, those are really important topics. The early church just wasn't focused on them. The early church was focused on principally the Trinity and the Incarnation, those two grand Christian mysteries. That's what most of that was kind of like, if you like, it's kind of a negative illustration, but it's kind of the black hole of Christian reflection. It went into who is this Jesus? Like, how do we talk about him the right way? and that's what got most of the reflection.
And Clement and that whole discussion, that's probably a good way to move us into the Western Latin church and moving into late antiquity and into the medieval period. There's definitely a change going on in there in the whole idea of justification and salvation. What were they thinking about these concepts? I think of the what do they call it? The well of grace that the church has and that the Pope has access to, and the of the saints and of Jesus, that they've paid for all of this, and that the papacy, at least in the medieval context, they could kind of dole that out. How does that all fit in?
Okay, well, now we get to the really interesting part of this whole discussion and the development of this doctrine. Justification, it comes from the Latin justificare. Justificare, that word did not exist until I think it was the 3rd or 4th century. It was a word that the church had to make up to translate this word to justify. And so the word that they made up, it's 2 words. If your listeners know any Latin, they'll get this. But justificare is justum, which is just, and then facere. Facere is just to do or to make. So you put those 2 concepts together and you have to make just. And in fact, Augustine, in one of his works, he says, what does justified, what does this word mean other than, and then in Latin he says, justifacti, to make righteous. What does justified mean other than to make righteous? Just as he justifies the ungodly, it means he makes a righteous person out of a godly person. Now, this is very significant, what Augustine is doing here. He is setting the tone for later theological reflection. You can kind of see here that it's how in Latin, how the word has been invented and how it's being explained by Augustine. It's not really capturing what the Hebrew was trying to say in the salvific context of God is giving us his righteousness and he's saving us. Rather, it's God is making us into a righteous person. Now, maybe before let's see here. I'm trying to think of when I want to bring this in. There's something I want to bring in, but I'm going to save it. I'll save it for a little bit later. So the key idea is that this term justificare, and that word make, the word make was seen not as like some type of a declarative statement about something, but rather as a process. And the process is God is making us more like himself. And so God makes us into a just person. Now, the key question is, well, how does God do that? What's the means by which God makes us a just person? And as the theology developed, the kind of the clearest expression or the clearest way that God makes us like himself is through the church, and especially through the sacrament. So we would say good works. So this is where the sacramental theology begins to develop in the West. And the idea of making righteous was now it was a process, and it was interpreted in light of the sacraments. So if we just step back and we look at the sacraments, we can actually line them up chronologically, and we can see that the sacraments correspond to all of the major phases of someone's life. And all of these phases are moments that God infuses more of his righteousness into us. So you have baptism, which by this time was infant baptism, followed by confirmation, and then your first Eucharist, which is then what you celebrate for all your life. If you verge off the path, you have the sacrament of penance, and you come back to the path and back to the Eucharist. And then at the end of your life, you're given extreme unction. Now that actually the end of your life was of later development, and then, so those are the 5 sacraments. And then there's 2 more, whether if you're married, you get a sacrament. And if you go into holy orders, it's another sacrament. But it's each of the major stages of your life, you get more grace because you're in the church and you're remaining faithful, and you're kind of being faithful to this new covenant that God has set up through his church. So one of the interesting things about this, at least from my standpoint, is that it seems like the church is talking about grace as if it's a thing. Like God is giving us more of this thing called grace, and then when our tank is filled, then we're just, and then we get to go to heaven. And I'll come back to that later. But the problem with this is the idea is to be made righteous, but the problem is that, I mean, really, who can say at the end of their life that they're righteous and that live like Christ? And so this is where the idea of purgatory comes in. So, let's say if you if you can think of this process of justification like a race, and let's say the race is 10 miles long, most of us in our lives, we can only run like a mile. And so purgatory is set up, and we can finish the race. We can be purged of our sinful inclinations, and by the end of purgatory, we will be purged of these sinful inclinations, and then we'll be just, and then we can go to heaven. And then, like you brought up earlier about the treasury of merits that the church has, there are a few very special people who are just in this life, and they've gotten their tank all the way filled up. They ran the 10 miles. And so anything else they have, it just kind of bubbles over, and it goes into this big treasure chest. I'm speaking kind of, it's not very reverently, but you get the point. It goes into this big container, and the person who is the custodian of that is the Pope. And he can say, okay, you're not a very good person. You're a Christian, but you're not a very good person. If you make a donation to the church, I will give you righteousness, and this will get you out of a lot of purgatory and maybe the whole way. Or then, start in the 11th century, 12th century on the Crusades. If you go on the Crusades, I have so much righteousness, I can give plenary indulgence. I can get every single one of you out of purgatory, so that if you die on the crusade, you'll go to heaven. So this is where the rubber meets the road as far as how the word justification was fleshed out in the life of the church. It was fleshed out through the sacraments. It really necessitates purgatory, and this is where the treasure of merits comes into play.
And that became really almost like an accounting system in many ways with purgatory, that if you did X, that equaled like literally some very specific amount of years off of your time in purgatory. But the Pope, who had access to that treasury of grace, he could dip the ladle in as often. It's my understanding that the treasury of grace was infinite.
Well, it could be infinite because Mary's works are in there, all the apostles, all the saints' works are in there, and I'm not sure if Christ's works are also in there or not. But Mary by herself would be more than enough.
And so, that's interesting because you can see where maybe some problems could seep into a system like that, especially in a time of like the Middle Ages and moving forward, where the Pope's power is both secular and religious, that certain bugs could start to work their way into a system like that.
Yeah, that was the beginning of the Reformation, and it actually started well before the Reformation. But that was kind of what the Reformation was about.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I've done reading about the Reformation. A lot of those, the things that kind of finally popped through with the Reformation had really been percolating in the system as far back as Augustine in the 300s and 400s, and they had entered some ideas of Catholic theology, and then some had left, some had come through, and it was really the Reformation took a lot of those ideas and ran with them in a particular direction.
Yeah, now that's a I can't speak as authoritatively on this, but I can tell you this, that Augustine kind of left us with an ambiguous relationship between, how do I want to say this? He left us with an ambiguous relationship between God working in our lives directly and God working in our lives through the church. So we would call this, like later, we would call this the relationship between faith and ecclesiology, or the church and the sacraments. He left us with an ambiguous inheritance, a legacy. Now, this didn't really affect the East as much because Augustine was just any other theologian. They had a much different theologians in the East, but in the West, Augustine was the theologian, and so he was the fount of all theological reflection after him. And so the Reformation, as some people have put it, at least from a Reformation perspective, if we have this kind of ambiguous relationship between, and I'm using the terms faith and sacraments here, it was the working out that faith is primary and sacraments are secondary. That's how a reformer would have looked at this relationship. I don't know if they ever quite put it in those terms, but when you step back and look at it, that's how it would have worked out.
It seems like maybe in the East, I did a little reading on the East and, and different things, but that or at least the original idea of the sacraments was kind of what you were saying, is that that's the thing that keeps kind of, keeping to the sacraments is the thing that keeps steering you onto the right path if you're getting off the path, and they're not an ends in themselves. They're the thing that it's the tool to getting back onto the salvation path.
Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I've never heard it quite phrased like that, but the great thing that the East has going for them is that they never lost contact with the Greek. Now they did lose it a little with the Hebrew, but they never lost it with the Greek. After Augustine, the West loses Hebrew and Greek. They have no way of checking what the Latin terms were translated. They just had the Latin. And so, it's kind of like this foundation. Well, actually, let me switch the illustration. It's kind of like, walking, and you want to turn around to see if you're still going in a straight line, but when you turn around, there's nothing there. And so you don't know which way you were coming from. You just kind of have to guess. And that's kind of what happened in the West, where they just lost the Greek, they lost the Hebrew, and it wasn't recovered until Constantinople fell, a little bit before that, but basically 15th century, where we have just this explosion of Greek and Hebrew back in the West, which is what also what sparked the Reformation.
Yeah, so that really feeds into the Reformation, and maybe we can start to talk about how the reformers, because there was definitely more inside the Reformation, there's more than one reformer, what they're starting to think about this idea of justification.
Yeah, so I mean, I wish we had time to talk about, Erasmus and what he did, but really the reformers couldn't have done what they did without Erasmus and what he did. And Erasmus died a faithful Catholic. He was never kicked out. He was never later his name was, at least here in Spain, his name was absolutely trashed. People hated him here in Spain, but he was a faithful son of the church, to say it like that. He is the one who was really good at Latin and Greek. I mean, he was just really good at it. We don't have time to go into how good he was, but he was he was good. And he was the one who started bringing up all these things. In the Latin Vulgate, he said, "Hey guys, it says here in Matthew, do penance like it's a sacrament." That's not what the Greek means, guys. It's not do penance like the sacrament. It just means repent in your heart. That's what God's saying. Well, there goes the whole sacrament of penance, if you like, or at least the foundation of it. And so he does this in a few places. And actually before him, Lorenzo Valla, he does it a century before. He starts, messing with the Latin. And I don't mean to bag on Jerome. I mean, if anyone's done translation work, it's hard stuff. I mean, I do translation work, and it's really hard. I'm not trying to bag on Jerome or his work, but we all make mistakes, and it's hard. But one of the ways that he really contributed to this was his reflection on Romans 4 and some of the language that was used there. So he actually, in his first edition, well, I've got a facsimile of his first edition back there. Not a real first edition, but I have a facsimile. I still had to pay a lot to get it. He actually changes the Vulgate there and how it renders the word loidzome. Loidzome is the Greek word for to impute or to reckon, what we were talking about earlier. And instead of the word reputare, which is the word that was in the Vulgate, he used the word imputare, to impute. And then in his kind of Bible commentary, he says, imputare, that's like acceptilatio, which is, acceptilatio is a forgiving someone of their debt just by verbally, saying, I forgive you of your debt. So you don't get any money back on your debt. It's just saying, okay, you owe me $20, I forgive you. Well, that is the word acceptilatio, and that is the word that he says, this is what loidzome means, to reckon someone. It's not like a process of anything. It's just, reckoning something to someone. So this is what I was thinking about adding earlier, and I guess this would probably be the time to bring it in now. In church history, there have been a few modern developments, but in church history, there have been 3 ways of looking at salvation. The first way was Pelagius, and he says, justification, it's my own justification. It's my own righteousness. So God tells me to do something, and I can do it if I want to. That was his whole point. That was rejected by the church. They said, and it was rejected by the church because of Augustine. Although interestingly, Pelagius found some support in the East. That's interesting. But at least the church in the West, they rejected that. So that was the first view. The second view is the view of Augustine and of Aquinas. And so they would say, it's not my righteousness. It's an alien righteousness. It's an external righteousness. It's God's righteousness, and he gives it to me. But the key term is that it's infused into me. It's given to me. And so he gives me his righteousness, but this righteousness brings about a moral transformation. Now, they were quick to add, and I think this is very important. I don't know if we take this into account, but they're quick to add that when God rewards us for our good works, he's actually just rewarding his own grace. So he infuses his righteousness into me, which brings about a moral transformation, which God then rewards. But when he rewards that, he's just rewarding the grace that he gave me to allow me to do that in the first place. So sometimes that important shade is missed when Protestants are talking about the Catholic position. That's usually missed. What Luther did was something that really had never been done before. We don't find anyone doing this in the early church or in the medieval church. Luther, he said he was in agreement with Augustine and Aquinas that righteousness is something alien. It's something external to me. It's not my own righteousness. It's God's righteousness. But not that it was infused into me, but that it's just imputed to me. So, and there's no way to increase it because it's Christ's righteousness itself. Christ can't have any more righteousness other than perfect, eternal, complete righteousness, and all of that is imputed to me. And that was the real novelty, and it was a novelty of the Reformation. It's not that it's an alien righteousness or a different righteousness. Everyone believed that. What was different is it's given to me all at once. That was the real novelty. So maybe I could read a quote from John Calvin. He kind of talks about what justification is, and I think he did it in a really nice, succinct manner. He said, "A man is said to be justified in the sight of God when, in the judgment of God, he is deemed righteousness. He's declared righteousness and is accepted on account of his righteousness." So we simply interpret justification as the acceptance with which God receives us into his favor as if we were righteous. And we say that this justification consists in the forgiveness of sins and the imputation of the righteousness of Christ. So he goes on a little bit more. But so that is how a Protestant, a reformer, would understand righteousness. Now, you asked a question earlier about how do works fit in, and how did Paul understand works to fit into faith? If he's always setting them up as kind of a dichotomy, then how do works play in the first place? And I think John Calvin really nailed Paul. I mean, he just really got him. Not nailed in a bad sense, but you know what I mean? He just summarized him really well. And so this is what John Calvin says as far as the relationship between faith and works. He says, the answer is very easy. As Christ cannot be divided into parts, so the two things, justification and sanctification, so justification would be faith and sanctification would be works. These are inseparable. Whoever God receives into his favor, he presents us with the spirit of adoption, whose agency forms them new in his image. So if the brightness of the sun can't be separated from its heat, you see the brightness and the heat, that's like faith and works. If the brightness of the sun can't be separated from its heat, are we to say that the earth is warmed by light and illumined by heat? So let me keep on reading here. Would you then obtain justification in Christ? You must previously possess Christ, but you cannot possess him without being made a partaker of his sanctification, because Christ cannot be divided. Since the Lord does not grant us the enjoyment of these blessings without bestowing himself, he bestows them both at once, but never the one without the other. Thus it appears how true it is that we are justified not without and yet not by works, since in the participation of Christ by which we are justified is contained not less sanctification than justification. So what the reformers did, and this is the novelty as far as the relationship with faith and works are concerned, they made a conceptual distinction between justification and sanctification, but they didn't make a formal distinction. In other words, no reformer would ever say, God saves us by faith and he's not going to change us. No reformer would ever say that. What the reformers said is, God saves us based on how he justifies us, but when God justifies us, not only does he impute Christ's righteousness to us, he also gives us his spirit, and his spirit is what changes us. So they made a conceptual distinction between the two, but they never separated them. They were always bound together. And so how do works fit in? To go back to your original question about Paul, how do works fit in? Works fit in as the consequence of us having a right relationship with God that necessarily evokes a change in our lives. And that change in our lives is, like we said at the very beginning, going back to Genesis 1 and 2 and living out the image of God. That's what the goal is. The goal is to live out the image of God. The question is, how do we get there? And the reformers said, God justifies us and he gives us his spirit, and that's how we get back there. So that was the real. So if you just allow me just to go just for a minute or two more, I know I'm talking long here. Two really good analogies for how a reformer would have understood a justification is marriage and adoption. So if you think of a king marrying a common woman, at the ceremony, legally, she actually becomes the queen, you know, in the eyes of the law, she is the queen. Now, she's a common woman, you know, her hands still have calluses and she doesn't know how to walk, you know, without having her head bounce around, and she doesn't know how to cross her legs the right way. But legally, when everyone looks at her, she is the queen. Now, by virtue of being the queen and through her exposure to the king and his life, she is going to change over time. And in a year, she's going to look more like a queen than she did when she was first married. And in 2 years, even more so, and et cetera, et cetera. She is and this is kind of paradoxical, but she is becoming what she already is. In other words, she is the queen, and she's becoming a queen. She is, but she is now fleshing that out, and that's the vision of the reform. Or you can look at it like adoption. If a rich person adopts a poor person, a poor child, a street child, a homeless child that's lived their whole lives abandoned, they adopt them. In the eyes of the law, they are their heirs. They are their sons. They are their daughters, however you want to look at it. But maybe they've never slept in a bed before. Maybe they've never had a hot plate of food before. Maybe they've never gone to school before. That doesn't change their legal status. Their status is that they are that person's child. So these would be some of the analogies that the reformers would use to talk about justification.
I think that analogy of the queen becoming legally a queen, and then like at one single point she becomes a queen at the end of that ceremony, but then she's still becoming a queen, and we probably don't have an exact verb tense to describe that process exactly in English. But in the reformers, and maybe even in the Catholic view and in a traditional view, what if this woman who becomes a queen, totally goes off the wrong path and she doesn't give up her rustic ways? Would she give up her queenship in some way?
That's a wonderful question, and that is a debate that even Protestants have within themselves. And so the issue that you brought up, that actually belongs to a kind of another issue related to this one, but it's kind of its own distinct issue too. That's called the perseverance of the saints, which probably isn't the best term. It should probably be something to have more of the faithfulness of God or something like that. Other traditions, like a Roman Catholic tradition, or even in the Protestant world, a Methodist tradition, they would talk about someone entering into justification, then actually leaving justification, or entering into God's family and leaving God's family. Let me say an introductory comment, and then I'll say what I'm going to say. But one of the hard things about talking about theology is that in order to talk about any one thing, you have to talk about the whole thing, because everything is interrelated. And so that's the introductory comment. What I want to say is this issue of justification then starts spinning off into all sorts of other interrelated issues. We've talked about one, the perseverance of the saints. Another one we've talked about is predestination, or we haven't talked about, is predestination. So predestination, which is clearly Augustinian and clearly in the Bible, it's a decree by God which can never be frustrated. So if you look at salvation from the perspective of predestination, those whom he predestined, he called. Those whom he called, he justified. Those whom he justified, he glorified. That is a continuous chain. There is no break in the chain. You go from predestination to glorification based on God's eternal decree. Now, the problem is that we don't know who has been predestined, and so we can only we can only evaluate based on what we see. And so we can talk about that issue that you brought up. What if the queen goes off the rails and stops living like a queen and all that? Well, the illustration kind of breaks down, because really it would be something like, maybe a better illustration would be to say something like, I've been adopted by a king who lives in another country. We don't know if that king has really adopted them, but based on what you're saying, maybe it looks like you've been adopted, or maybe, wow, you have a lot of money now, or you're changing your ways or something like that. But it would be impossible for us to verify whether that's happened or not. Whereas with the queen illustration, it's kind of easier to verify whether that's happened.
We're kind of coming towards the end here, and I think you've painted a picture of maybe that the reformers and the Catholic and this whole, you could put them all in the umbrella of the Western tradition of Christianity. In many ways, they're kind of far apart, but I think in the balance, they're not that far apart in the idea of justification. Where might be some opportunities for the Catholic Church and the Reformed churches and the churches of the Protestant Reformation to maybe come together in compromise, or to maybe smooth out some of these rough edges that they have between each other. Kind of our kumbaya moment at the end.
Yeah, now this is just like a very good question, a very good question. And again, the answer is very complicated. You're not the first one to ask this question. The Reformers and the Catholics themselves were asking themselves these questions, and the other side this question. They all wanted to have this kind of come together moment. In fact, in 1541, I'm not sure if you covered this on your episode, but in 1541, at the Colloquy of Regensburg in Germany, major players from both sides came down and had a meeting. That would be a wonderful episode to have on the Colloquy of Regensburg. And they actually signed a joint confession of faith. Now, there's some, there's some debate over whether this was a forced signing or what. But part of this decree they signed, one of the articles was on justification, believe it or not. And Catholics and Protestants were able to sign a joint declaration on the doctrine of justification. Now, that phrase I just used is actually the title of a book that was signed in the 1990s, the joint declaration of the doctrine of justification between Lutherans and Catholics. But they came together and they were actually able to sign something, but it never really took. No one really believed it. And it looked like what they did is, you can almost imagine Reformers writing down what they believe, Catholics writing down what they believe, and then someone coming and cutting them up and then just gluing them all together into one. One sentence reads very Protestant, and the next one reads very Catholic, and the next one reads Protestant, the next one very Catholic, and it just doesn't really fit, and it never really convinced anyone. People hoped that it would, but it never really convinced anyone, and that's what has also proven to happen in the joint declaration, the doctrine of justification. When Protestants and Catholics come together and they talk seriously about uniting on this one issue, and this really was the big issue. I mean, there's a few other cosmetic issues like authority, and some things of the liturgy. There were some other issues, but the real heart of the issue is this issue of how are we forgiven of our sins. And they tried it in the 16th century. They have been trying it in the second half of the 20th century, and it's still going on in the first half of the 21st century. But they still haven't found a way to come together. Now, there's a few options on the table about what it could look like. One option is the Reformers are completely right, and the Catholics are completely wrong, and the Catholics have to believe like the Reformers do. Another view would be the Catholics are completely right, and the Protestants are completely wrong, and the Protestants have to believe just like the Catholics do. It could be they're both seeing part of the truth, and then they're absolutizing the part that they see, and someone is going to come along and say, no, look, they both fit together. And that's kind of what happened at Regensburg in 1541. That's kind of what they were doing. The other way out, a fourth way, would be to say, we're not going to look at it in these terms anymore. There's actually a different way of looking at the whole issue. And when we look at it like this way is more satisfying, and we all agree with this, and this is enough. That would be another way. And I don't know if the Eastern Church could present the Western Church with a way of looking at salvation like that. I know a little bit about Eastern theology, but I don't know if they could do that or not. That would be interesting. And I don't know about Eastern ecumenical discussions with Protestants and with Catholics well enough to talk about that. But those are kind of the four options that I see on the table.
Well, that's really interesting. I think this is a big episode and a big topic, and I think it's left people with a lot to think about. Is there maybe one more point you have to leave us with on this thought, or on this whole idea?
Well, yeah, I guess I'd like to maybe just start off or end where we started off. It's easy to think of these things as abstract debates that don't affect our lives, but we're talking about, real issues here about, from a Christian perspective, God is offering us real salvation in Christ, and not just abstract salvation, but salvation in the here and now. He's offering us salvation. How do we get that? And so, it's not an issue to be taken lightly. They certainly didn't think it was an issue to be taken lightly in the 16th century. And it is sad what happened. I don't think anyone celebrates the division of the church. I don't think anyone likes all of the wars that spun out from that. So it is a tragedy, but I don't think the way going forward is just to kind of paper over things and say it doesn't really matter. I think it does matter, but I think that there are ways forward. And I probably just, I don't know if you have any Catholic or Orthodox or Coptic or Indian or listeners, but it would be worthy of more dialogue if any of your listeners, have read up on the issue, studied it out. It would be interesting to dialogue more with them, and I think all the audience would grow and appreciate that.
Yeah, it really is a practical driver of history. You can't just say that this was all a cynical ploy. This really did feed into the hundreds and thousands of years of conflict, and it's what pushed history and actions of actual people forward. Well, I want to thank you again for really presenting this really interesting topic and helping me understand it, and I know helping a lot of other people out there understand this really complicated topic that really serves a fundamental core of the history of Christianity.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to the comments and further dialogue.
Yeah, and you are definitely welcome back. When you want to talk about something, let me know, and you're always welcome.